start by saying one thing. When we ask why some countries are rich and some countries are poor, you can trace back through a chain of proximate determinants, in the sense that you could say, well, I can explain that by, well, they have highly productive firms, but highly productive firms is a consequence of other things, and so the question is, how far back do you trace it? Now, so the one thing I want to say is, the main key to highly productive economy is developing ways in which human beings cooperate. So sometimes economists are thought of as individualistic, but in reality we're the opposite. What a highly productive economy means is that lots of different people cooperate through a very long and complex chain of creating value, and implicitly through your daily economic transactions, you're cooperating with thousands and thousands of individuals who you've never met. So if you think of your shirt, right? The shirt you're wearing was produced by people you will never meet. So a very poor society is a society that can only manage to create very limited cooperation among individuals. And then you're kind of stuck to the production that you can do and you can do with 3 other people. And as economies get more sophisticated, they get more specialized, and specialization requires essentially that I am able to, at arm's length, without direct personal knowledge, cooperate with thousands and thousands of people. So what we mean in some sense by institutions are mechanisms whereby human cooperation can be extended in time and space, so that the value that you can create as a person isn't limited by you only cooperating with people you know. You can just, wait for some firm to produce an input into your production process and buy it in, and everything that happens in that firm can be invisible to you because you just have a market transaction where they sell you the input. So I think if you want to start with thinking, what are the, who's rich and who's poor? Rich countries have developed mechanisms whereby thousands and millions of people can cooperate in producing value in smooth, low-cost, predictable ways. And poor places, Adam and Eve, you probably know Adam and Eve, whatever the equivalent of Adam and Eve, were poor because they didn't have anybody to cooperate with. And societies that can't develop low-cost, smooth, predictable mechanisms for extending cooperation in time and space can't produce sophisticated, complex things, and hence are going to be poorer than people who can. Let me start with that. And let me just elaborate one more thing. Sorry, I said one thing, I'll say 2 things. So when I say the world isn't full of poor people, it's people in poor places, that's actually the result of research that we've done. And my co-authors and I, we looked at what are the wage differentials of essentially exactly the same people when they move from place to place. Because that reveals how much of the productivity is the person and how much of the productivity is just place specific. We call it the place premium. And we were able to, economics papers are long and complex, but the bottom line is a person moving from a low wage country to the United States, their wages go up 5-fold. So they go from $2 an hour to $10 an hour instantaneously, essentially. So the productivity of the person hasn't changed at all. It's they just gain being a person in a high productivity place. And then if you ask, why is that new place more productive? It's because it has enabled itself to make more complex and sophisticated production. And so once you embed yourself into that place, you immediately are rewarded with the productivity of the place. And we can show that, most of the inequality in the world is not that people's intrinsic productivity is different. A lot of it is just people are attempting to utilize their existing personal productivity in a low productivity place. And then it's very hard to raise their productivity, because if you're in a low productivity place, there's only so much I can do. So that's the same.
So you live in Utah, and America is a very prosperous country. Could you explain America's prosperity?
Could I explain
just
what?
The history of it? How did it become the richest country or the biggest economy in the world? So one you said was it put these institutions which allowed people to collaborate.
Yeah.
What else did it do right? Human capital? Or not that important? Economic students, when they start seem to say resources matter. If you have a lot of gold or oil, that matters. That doesn't. You said that doesn't matter.
It does. Yeah. So I think what the U.S. got right is it created a way where if I built a better mousetrap, people would beat a path to my door. So we created a system where people had the freedom and liberty and legal ability, meaning it wasn't banned or forbidden, to go out and try something out. Go try it. But if it doesn't work, we're not going to support it. But if it does, we have all of the ancillary ways in which you can produce it, market, sell it, borrow money for it. So there's this simultaneous building of, again, ways in which you can interact with arm's length to attract finance, arm's length to buy land. I don't need to know a person who gives me land. If I need a land for my thing, there's a market for land. There's a way in which I can, acquire the resources I need. So to some extent, it's creating institutions that facilitate and encourage people to try new stuff, because if they try new stuff and it's really successful, they will make huge rewards, and they will be able to attract all of the resources they need to scale it. So, and that is I actually tend not to use the word institutions, because it's a little bit like the word furniture. Get me some good furniture. Well, what can I say about furniture at the level of abstraction of furniture? I think when we talk about what the important institutions are, they are institutions, again, that allow human beings to cooperate over time and space. So one way I can cooperate over time is I can take a loan from a bank, and the bank gives me loans because it knows it can enforce my repayment when repayment comes due. And so that's a mechanism where we can cooperate over time. I'll give you money now, you give me back money later. If we lack enforcement mechanisms of debt, then we can only cooperate in the current, what I can give you, you give me, contemporaneous, right? Same thing with space. If I don't have reliable mechanisms of contracting, I can't ship something to somebody halfway out around the country and be confident he'll pay me. So I think it's this, again, you don't usually think of markets and as mechanisms of cooperation, but if you think through the thing is, in economic history, only one thing ever happened. Meaning, if you look at the prosperity or productivity of human beings, it was roughly the same from Adam and Eve to 1600. Why? because you were still relying on mechanisms that intermediated transactions among individuals that were very high cost, very low predictability, and weren't very smooth. And what happened sometime in about the late 1700s is society started to develop ways in which they could have large-scale cooperation intermediated by arm's length mechanisms like banks, like property rights, like the joint stock firm, which actually came a little later. And so this is what we mean by institutions that facilitate transactions. And then all of a sudden, the scope over which you could cooperate just radically expanded in time and space.
So the three other suspects,
This is,
which have
by the
not
way,
been
this is the first time I've ever explained it like this to
To
anyone.
the
So I'm
kids.
trying it out.
So-
You're the first audience that's ever heard this version of this.
So one thing which many Indians walk around is Great Britain is rich because of their colonies, and India is poor because we were colonized. How would you respond to both those theses? I disagree with both of them, but would you see that England is rich because they had colonies?
I am happy to hate the British. They were my colonialist taskmasters too. But, and B, I always hate this framing of the question because colonialism was an immoral relationship between peoples. So I'm not condoning colonialism, But no, the data is really clear that England did not get rich because of colonialism. It just, their prosperity sort of slightly preceded it. On net, colonialism was a wash for Great Britain. So colonialism made some British and some Scottish people fantastically wealthy. But if you look at the costs of the empire versus the benefits of the empire, it was actually a wash. It was actually taxpayers supporting the mechanisms of enforcement of colonialism to make a few very rich people a few people very rich. So on net, it was kind of a wash. Now, that said, colonialism was probably worse for India than it was good for the UK. So it's not symmetric. I do think being colonized impeded the working out of the endogenous and organic development of the mechanisms that would facilitate high productivity. I'm probably, you guys are like 11th, 12th grade. Maybe I'm being too abstract, but I'm just saying, because if you ask how the U.S. got rich, it was an organic process in which the mechanisms of facilitating industries and transaction co-evolved with those industries, right? And that was a joint political, it was a political and social process as well as a technological and economic process. And colonialism interrupted that development because all the colonialists wanted were the institutions they needed to extract. And so there was it interrupted the organic process of development. So colonialism could have been really bad for India, but not really good for the UK.
So two more before, and
Yeah.
you guys have lots of questions, I know. Education, you don't think matters for prosperity, or it matters but not as much as this cooperation institution? Because we learned in economics that human capital education is the heart, and I know you've talked about schooling isn't learning.
Yeah. So I wrote a paper, and I think if you've done IB economics, you probably can read my papers because I'm not that sophisticated mathematically anyway. And so I'm a middle-brow empiricist. So anyway, I wrote a paper called "Where Has All the Education Gone?" Right? And the main point is the experiment of how much would the world be better off if everybody had schooling is an experiment the world has run. world in 1950, the average child in the developing world had 2 years of schooling, which meant about 80% of people had no schooling. And today, even in the poorest countries in the world, here's an amazing fact. Today, the average adult in Haiti has more years of schooling than the average adult in France in 1970. That's amazing, right? Haiti is verging back into anarchy. It's a terrible, chaotic, poor place, and yet it's managed to create schooling. So we know for sure that schooling doesn't drive economic growth. The debate's over because we did it, right? you might say, well, I think this has happened, but then if you do it, you know whether or not it had the consequences you know, and the countries that expanded, the pace at which your country expanded schooling is completely uncorrelated with the growth of GDP per worker, just uncorrelated. So everybody looks at Korea and says, oh, Korea, wow, they put a lot of kids in school, they expanded schooling. Well, yeah, but so did Kenya. And so it's not the differentiating factor. Okay, which then leads to two other questions. Where has all the education gone? And there are two reasons why schooling didn't produce the impact on economic growth that one might have thought. One is that a lot of schooling and a lot of the expansion of schooling hasn't created any useful skills. I don't want to, I love India, so I'm not going to give you Indian statistics, so I'll talk about other countries, but you can go look up the statistics about your own country. But in places in Africa, only about 30% of kids finish primary schooling able to read a sentence. And then you're like, well, what's going to be the economic impact of this child having 6 years of schooling? Well, geez, if they didn't actually acquire any skills, the whole causal mechanism was school would create skills, competencies, capabilities, which would be value and increase their productivity. It just doesn't work. So first, one significant part of the explanation of why schooling didn't produce growth is that schooling didn't produce learning at the pace we know is possible. And so countries, and I just finished a paper 2 weeks ago because I'm 65 years old, I still write papers. If you look and ask how much does a year of schooling contribute, now that we have better data on learning, we can show that if you got a year of schooling in a country where learning was very high, it actually contributed a lot. And if you got a year of schooling in a country where learning was very low, its expected contribution is very low. So that all makes sense, right? If I don't learn, nobody thought, I sometimes say that the only thing we measure in the same units we measure schooling is prison. Like we measure schooling in time served. Did you finish first grade? Yeah. Did you finish second grade? Yeah. Did you finish third grade? That's time served, right? The only other thing we measure in time served is prison, which probably your teachers don't like me saying this, but anyway. Okay, then by the way, but in addition to that, there's another thing. And the other thing is, if you get lots more human capital in a disorganized, disorderly country in which you're not able to utilize your human capital in cooperation with lots of other people, again, the gain just isn't that big, right? So, if I have, I could be the brightest, most capable, knowledgeable person in Haiti, but since Haiti doesn't have mechanisms that allow me to embed myself in complex production chains with low cost, smooth, predictable transactions, I'm going to have low wages. Even if I'm the best doctor in Haiti, my wages in Haiti, my productivity in Haiti is going to be low, and hence my wages are going to be low. And so there is this interactive effect that if you just push more human capital into an otherwise dysfunctional economy, it's not going to turn the economy around because these are place-wide factors. So I think, the Russians, by the way, the Russians pre-transition had some of the best education outcomes in the world, but then they would put those skills to use in an economic system that couldn't utilize them. So you didn't get the growth impact out of that.
Communist countries did human capital better.
What?
Communist countries did human capital well. China and Russia, or not really?
Yeah, well, yeah.
They did use the human capital, but they
Yes,
didn't.
yes. Communist countries, on average, I think.
Hard to say.
I know too much.
Hard to say. You
I
know
know
too
more
much.
than, in the sense that, if we talk about the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, on average they had, but this is an important point. On average, they had much higher scores on international assessments of learning than other countries at their level of income. Now you might say, oh, that's really terrific, they had good scores for low income, but you've got to be able to flip that relationship around. It's like, why the hell did they have such low income? Right? It's not a badge of honor to say, gee, I'm really smart, but I'm unproductive. Like, that's not a good thing, right? And so yes, relative to their GDP, all of the Eastern European and former Soviet Union vastly, substantially outperformed other countries more on math than on other stuff, because again, it was valued, right? Technocracy was valued. They didn't so much appreciate Solzhenitsyn and stuff, so the other aspects of education were a little limited.
So you guys have questions? I have a last one, otherwise I can. You said resources don't matter,
Yeah.
colonialism doesn't matter. You're mixed on human capital.
Yeah.
You're mixed on weather, not really. Hot places, cold places, not really. Doesn't explain anything. The only one I want to ask you is culture. Because there are a lot of people who walk around, Americans are more entrepreneurial, there's something called the Hindu rate of growth, or Chinese Confucianism. Does culture explain, is there some such thing as some countries are better at building prosperity than others, or that's just a lazy explanation?
I've heard that the Chinese leader Chow En-lai used to say, when I hear the word culture, I reach for my gun.
I reach for my gun.
Yeah, I reach for my gun. Meaning, I think, by and large, I completely disbelieve culture stories. Rudyard Kipling, speaking of colonialism, had these just so stories where he would say, why does the elephant have a long trunk? Well, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so most things about culture, I think, are just so stories, because every country, if you start to name wildly successful countries, that I can tell you, I can go 10 years before they came successful and find somebody saying this country would never be successful because of their culture. So in the people used to say the Japanese could never be successful at economics because of their hidebound ancestor worship culture, and then it was bullshit. And people used to say the Koreans had this Confucian thing and they'd never be productive. It was bullshit. People used to say the Chinese didn't have a culture that was compatible. That was bullshit. So it was just like, it's easy to look at failure and then just say, well, that's their culture is kind of an excuse for having some underlying really thing. But when the institutions and opportunities change, what you find is every society has people who are willing to give it a go. Every society has people who are willing to be entrepreneurial. Every society, once you create a system that elicits that, I think it's really hard to find the case where you had all of the preconditions where an economic system would highly reward you for pushing forward productivity, and then you lacked somehow people to do it. So I disbelieve culture stories because they don't fit the time series nature of what the world looks like. And what the world looks like is countries can often stagnate for long times and then have a huge boom. And what changed is not the culture, right? So if it were really culture, these things should be much more stable than they are in reality.
Over time. You guys have questions? Go ahead. Working? Yeah.
Yes. So in economics, one of the things I noticed is that The theories and the concepts we read in books and papers, they're not always that easy to replicate in real life. So what can governments or nations do to actually instigate these theories and initiate those sort of changes for the economy?
What kind of theories?
So, like, for example, cooperation. We talked about how cooperation is important in differentiating between rich and poor countries. So how can a country really sort of develop cooperation?
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of economics and economic theory can get and look very complicated because it involves formal mathematical representations. But when I was a PhD student, my professor said, 90% of the value of economics comes with the first deep understanding of some core principles. So economics isn't that complicated, really. You can get to some really, it's only at the cutting edge, but if you come back and say, people are more likely to innovate and do something new if they have predictable, claims over the fruits of their endeavor, that's not super complicated, right? And then you ask, how would I instantiate that in terms of banks, or how would I instantiate that in terms of contracts with contractual enforcement? Again, that's not, getting the basics of that right isn't technically hard. It's actually, nearly all of the problem is creating a political situation in which the elite settlement of the fundamental order of the society wants to create mechanisms that allow lots of people to do lots of different things in an open way. Again, once you have the political will to do it, the technical part of creating a reasonable looking banking system or a reasonable looking land market, it's not a technically complex thing to say who owns which land for which uses. It's something that countries have done since the 1800s, right? So India today, I have a graph, and I can send anybody a link. I have a recent blog called Economic Growth in 5 Figures that shows some graphs about economic growth. But if you look at that, again, there's only one thing that happened in history. So if you look at the historical trajectory of what the GDP per capita of the leading country was, we can go back to historians have created GDP estimates of some countries back to 0 AD. The reality is that most countries that are poor in the world today are poorer than the leading country of the world was in 1800. Which means by 1800, people had figured out to be more productive than many countries are today, which means it's not a technical obstacle. It can't be technically that hard to create the preconditions for at least the productivity that the UK had in 1800, because the UK could do it in 1800. So it's not that. I think I'm being responsive. It's not that hard. It's much more, mapping economist ideas into practice is much more, the barrier is much more, does the powers that be in the society really want this done, is much more the binding constraint to success than can I figure out how to do this if I really want to do it.
Yeah, I think that's why all of you you can't unpack politics and economics as much as you think, right? I work a lot with government, and my biggest question is, how do you get something done in government after everybody who matters in government agrees with you? Right, you have to think of that.
Yeah.
The technical part, as Lant is saying, the theory all of us agree on. We know how to build infrastructure, we know how to run schools, we know how to run courts, but we don't know how to run political economy. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
earlier you mentioned that like a worker who probably works for maybe $2 a day in a specific region moves to a country like the United States, has a 5-fold increase. However, GDP per capita is different in each country, poverty lines are different in each country, so would they still be relatively poor to the economy which they are in? And like, would you not be able to escape a situation like that?
Would their cost of living be so much higher?
So first of all, every number I ever use is adjusted for relative differences in cost of living. So when I say $2 an hour and $10 an hour, that's in what we call purchasing power parity adjusted units. So those units have the same purchasing power in the two places. So the absolute material standard of living has really gone up by 5-fold. So that technical detail, I'm a professional economist.
Yeah, so
I don't
as
make
an
mistakes
amateur,
on
if
stuff
I
like that.
told you,
But
I would say 2
now
times.
that said, you could go from being relatively rich in a poor country to being relatively poor in a rich country and still have your absolute material well-being go up tenfold, but that's not relevant to the point I was using it for, which is your productivity, your absolute standard of living has gone up because it's justified by the fact that your productivity, nobody's giving you stuff because you're in this country. You're worth it to an employer to employ at that wage in the country, because in that country your wage has gone up. So on the more technical side, every number I ever use that compares across countries compares them in terms of purchasing power parity units. And if you look in non-purchasing power parity, it's a factor of 10 or 20, so it's even bigger.
Yeah, so
And then
it's
secondly,
25 is what I would,
Yeah.
if you were worried about 5 being too low, if you just used absolute dollars, it would be 25 times.
Yeah, it would be much bigger.
So it would be, a carpenter who moves from Balasore in Odisha to Lucknow gets 2 times more salary. They move from Lucknow to Bangalore, they get 4 times more salary. And if they move from Bangalore to Chicago, they get 25 times more salary. Just in absolute dollars. He's adjusted it for purchasing power.
I adjusted it already for purchasing power parity. Everybody understands purchasing power parity. It's just let's compare the prices of equivalent bundle of goods in the two places and have units that reflect that.
Go ahead.
Okay.
So my question, although it's probably impossible to predict, I just wanted your opinion on if institutions are such a big determining factor of whether a country is rich or not. Firstly, do you think you could predict which countries are going to grow in terms of their economy and which countries are going to become rich? And if so, which countries?
So, okay, so one set of papers that I've done on the dynamics of economic growth emphasize that high or low economic growth is less a it's not a characteristic, it's a condition, right? So like I'm right-handed today, I'm right-handed tomorrow, a year from now I'll be right-handed, 10 years from now I'll be right-handed. But right now I'm jet lagged. Well, jet lag is a condition, not a characteristic, right? So I don't do a lot of predicting of growth because growth is amazingly volatile. Most people think, and again, complacency sets in, India has high growth, so therefore we can, all the time the media will go, in 2050, GDP in Japan or China will be X, and it's like, that's the stupidest thing you could ever say, because like no one can accurately forecast what growth rates of countries will be far into the future, A. Right? B, you're asking a much deeper question, right? And the answer to this question and where I am currently, the answer to this question is some countries create economic growth by shortcuts that create the conditions for growth, but by undermining the institutions that would sustain future growth. So I have, again, a set of papers about deals versus rules, right? And what ultimately led to the long-term prosperity of the now rich countries is they organically developed a set of rules that, and the expectations of what would happen to you could be grounded in the rules. Like if I wanted to know, if I buy this piece of property, will I be able to have access to this piece of property 5 years from now or 10 years from now? It was grounded in the fact that that was the rule, and I had reasonable confidence the rule would be enforced by mechanisms, the law system, right? Now, the problem is it's really hard to create that because the credibility of rules requires a whole set of ancillary organizations and practices that instantiate the rule as a predictable thing. So I only have one way of talking, so maybe this isn't the right way to, but I think you're all smart. So okay, anyway, I'm just saying you can create a new rule, but you can't immediately create a rule that creates stable expectations into the future. Because if I say, well, now the rule is, everybody gets an ice cream cone for every day for the rest of your life, like what the hell? How are you going to deliver on that? And if you haven't created a mechanism for delivering on that, my expectation I'll get an ice cream cone a month from now might not be changed by you having announced a rule that everybody gets an ice cream cone, right? The way around that is to create deals. And the way you create a deal is the government or people in power say to a particular person with a particular last name, hey, if you build a factory and we share in some of the benefits of that, we will guarantee that you have all of that you need to make that factory productive. And it's a deal because it's not general to anybody else. It's a transaction between sets of identifiable individuals, right? But it turns out you can create from poor countries extended episodes of high growth with a deals-based approach. The problem is, if the deal involves that I'm doing favors for you that involve not enforcing the law, like, I'm going to let you go dig that coal mine, and yeah, we have some environmental and I'm not talking about India, I'm talking about other countries. I don't want to be a rude guest and talk about my host's country, but other countries, they might say, sure, we have environmental regulations about digging coal, but for you, we're not going to enforce those. So go ahead, get the coal out. We're going to take some cut on it. The problem is that undermines the credibility of the organizations and institutions that are supposed to enforce the law. So you've increased economic growth in the short run, but you have undermined the preconditions for longer term growth. So if I were predicting who is going to do well and likely to sustain growth and who might be in a short-term burst of growth but is unlikely to sustain it, I would focus on whether the current way in which they're generating growth is reinforcing the possibilities for other people to innovate and do other new things through arm's length, low-cost, smooth, predictable institutions, or whether it's undermining those institutions. And if it's undermining the institutions, sooner or later that growth episode is likely to come to a very unhappy end, because when the power that created the deal ends, all expectations disappear. And then it's very hard to say, okay, well, am I going to invest in this country? So, let's use the example of Egypt. And there's a very funny joke that I'll tell you maybe, but maybe not. We'll see how many more questions there are. Anyway, take the country of Egypt. Egypt under the regime that went from Nasser to Sadat to Mubarak developed, a closed order deal system where the army and members of the Mubarak family got favorable treatment, but it undermined the credibility of any institution. So when they failed and were overthrown, everybody was super happy, but then you realized, who's going to invest in Egypt? Because if I invest in Egypt, how will I be treated? And there was no credibility that I would be treated according to the law, because there was no habits and practices of rule of law, and the new government couldn't immediately create credibility because who knows whether you'll last. So anyway, so all of this comes to the pathway to prosperity is to get on a path in which you create growth in ways that creates more opportunities for growth by reinforcing the solidity and predictability through institutionalizing it. And the quick way to get growth is to cut deals with specific individuals or firms, but those are deals that almost necessarily undermine the credibility of just arm's length institutions, because, you know, if I'm a bank and I'm forced to lend money to, you know, and again, not talking about India, but if I'm a bank and I'm forced to lend money to this particular group because they're in bed with a particular political powerful person, that bank isn't developing practices of how to, you know, properly lend money, right? And it's undermining the institutional integrity of the bank as a bank. Does that make sense?
So I didn't ask about corruption, and this deals versus rules I would urge you all to think about, because what is corruption? Corruption is show me the person, I'll show you the rule.
Yeah.
Right? It's the transmission loss between how the law is written, interpreted, practiced, and enforced. We all know how the law is written, but in India, sometimes if somebody follows the rule, you feel like you missed a deal, right?
Yeah.
You say that I should have spoken to somebody, why should I do this, why should I do that? And I think in the long run that is corrosive. In fact, our whole reform process since 1991 has been trying to move away from deals to rules. You had a question there? Yes.
One last.
So you spoke about how education.
Go ahead, go ahead.
You spoke about
No,
how
I'm just blocking, there's a spotlight right in my
you
head.
spoke about how education, culture, and collaboration and cooperation helps foster development. But to what extent does structural stability and political stability of a country foster development?
How important is political stability?
Yeah.
What do you define as political
Yeah,
stability?
so this is the thing, is that you actually want stability that isn't political.
I didn't catch that.
Meaning, the question for economics is, can I form stable predictions about what will happen to me into the future? That's, you don't, like, precisely what you don't want is that depends on which particular party is in power. I mean, if you need political stability, you're in a bad condition. The stability should be generated, and again, this is why the people use the word institutions, right? So if you've taken a loan from a bank that you have to pay back a mortgage over the next 30 years, you know, nobody wants whether or not you have to pay that loan back to be contingent on the party in power, right? So the politics should be able to change without changing the expectations. So to some extent, you know, do you mean, and this is, I think, what Manish was going to get at, when people say political stability, are you talking about you have the same party in power? Are you talking about the political regime is the same? So you know, stability is important, but whether that's
structural
political stability. I mean, if it's again, if political stability disrupts the stability of expectations, then yes, political stability is necessary. But if by political stability you mean a single party in
What
power,
did you
or
mean?
an
What was your
authoritarian
question?
government,
Elaborate your
then
question.
No, you don't
Do
need
you think
political
that
stability
the
like
same
that.
party in power provides political stability?
Yeah, is that what you
What
mean?
was your
Not the same party, but the structure of the whole
Yeah,
country, the
yeah, yeah.
regime they're following. And
That is institutions, right?
Yeah, that's what we mean by institutions.
You want the courts, you want institutions, you want the central bank, you want the rules to stay the same independent of which party is in political power. If they have to change every 5 years, then most investments take you 10, 20 years, then people won't make those investments.
Yeah, I mean, the paradox is you want politics to matter, but not too much,
okay.
right? Because after all, if the politics change, revolutions are when the politics change everybody's expectations about everything, right? And the probability of a revolution, meaning, by revolution I would mean none of the existing contracts and arrangements and patterns of cooperation necessarily survive across this cataclysmic change, then yeah, revolutions are, really disruptive, right? But if you mean, do we need to have the LDP, which is the party in Japan that's been elected democratically, except for maybe 2 years for all the post-war period, do we need that kind of stability? No. We want a system where we don't need political stability to have economic stability.
Some of you need to leave, right? They need to all leave. I think there's some people with more questions. You can walk up to Lant if you have. Yeah, I think you have one and you have one.
I have just one quick question, Lant. We are always telling our kids that you should make an attempt to stay in India if you possibly can for your undergrad. And when you said that it doesn't help to be the smartest person in, say, Haiti, where it feels like that's a guidance to them to go running off to America as well. Where is India on that trajectory? And is there a critical point at which it becomes obvious that to be the smartest person in India is a better deal than going and being one of, I don't know how many in America?
Yeah, so, I mean, the thing is you should take into account is what your lifetime trajectory looks like.
What's your?
What your lifetime trajectory looks like. Meaning, I first came to India in 1991. I am super optimistic about India. I think India is too big and too chaotic to fail. And so I'm not denying that. Oh, it's so orderly. It's chaotic and it's got. But on the other hand, it's got a lot of dynamism. So I certainly, if I were Indian, I would stay in India because I have an anticipation that India is low productivity now, but is again getting higher productivity and has a long ways to go. And you could stay and be part of that process. That said, spending some part of your life in another country isn't a terrible thing either. But the propensity to migrate empirically is actually U-shaped. People don't migrate so much from very poor countries, and then they kind of stop migrating at high levels. So I think, but you don't want to just think about what the current wages and current productivity is. They're 16 years old. What's it going to be like for the next, till they're 66? And I think what really creates migration is when you lose faith in the future of your place, but absolutely no reason why anyone should lose faith in the future of India. India's, I brought my children to India when they were this age because I said, come see the people that are going to rule the world. Come get to know Indians now because they're going to rule the world. So I am a very optimistic on India person in the long run because it's too chaotic, too uncontrolled, too vibrant to fail.
Okay, as we end this session, our heartfelt gratitude to Professor Lant and Manish sir. Just one round of applause. Okay, so we'll leave the room in an orderly fashion. From the first bench, please start. Thank you.
If one or two of you want to talk to us, please feel free to walk up.
Class. I don't want to keep anybody from class. Okay, demerits. They'll get undemerit. Okay. Some people stay? Yes, why don't we let the leaders lead and it's an interactive event. So one of the reasons, so there's two different reasons. One of the reasons is you're not learning anything, but if you learn more, learn that. And so one of the reasons why, this is why Haiti has both reasons. A, you go to school in Haiti, you don't learn a ton, and then even if you do learn a ton, it's hard to utilize this curriculum. But both. So stay in school. Well, yes. Well, I mean, a lot of it is just mechanisms whereby if you have an idea, right, can you do it? Can you attract the factors you need to give it a go? Is there finance? Can I attract finance? Are there markets for labor? Can I hire labor? So this is what this is kind of what I mean is there's a good short book called "Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich," which summarizes the work of economic historian Dietmar Slavsky, and she characterizes what makes country rich is this kind of created the conditions where you can give it a go. Like, and I like that phrase. Like, I've just made it possible for you to give it a go. I don't make for sure that you'll succeed or that you'll fail. And so then when you ask what those mechanisms are, basically it's legal permission, which involves again not having such regulatory obstacles you can't ever get going, and then do I have mechanisms where I can attract the needed factors? I have to have some place to work. Can I get land? If I can't get land, it's going to be harder to start a company if I can't get land. Can I hire workers without excessive costs and complications, right? So can I attract somebody who will finance me? Maybe with debt, maybe with equity, maybe with some sophisticated instruments, so I can get going. So those are the underlying support structures that allow people to give it a go. So I can go and I can invent some new company, and then if the company works, it can scale. And a lot of productivity growth is actually what we call ecological, meaning a lot of productivity growth isn't that the existing firms get more productive. It's that new firms start that are more productive than the old firms and then take market share away from the more productive firms. So having that kind of dynamism is the key. Is that what you were asking?
So what do you think the next step for India is to foster a better level of economic development? Because I've heard quite a bit that increasing the skill set of the general population is going to be very important or detrimental for our future. What do you think?
So yes, but no. Meaning, there are facilitating factors in the